Hey guys, what is up? AwesomeTheSauce here. Hope you guys are having a great day and welcome to the first of many test realm videos. Now this one is kind of special because the devs decided to do something that they've never done before, which is actually put out notes before the test realm even dropped, which is insanely awesome. You know, it lets us know the why, the hows, the reasoning behind some of the updates. I hope that they always do this because I feel like it's a lot easier to see where devs come from when you know their thought process before the actual test realm drops. So before the test realm is even dropping, we're getting some insight on one of the craziest new updates, and it'll affect PvP a ton. What am I talking about? I'm talking about crit. I'm talking about block. Now before we get right into what they're changing, let's look at how the crit and block system work. Right now, crit and block are completely based on probability. You can amp up a rating, and you have some arbitrary chance of basically getting a crit. On my fire, I happen to have 48%, which means 48% of the time I'll crit, and as you can see, I have 209 blocks, so if someone is to crit, 7% of the time I'll block. Now, when you look at it like that, it seems like it's not really, you know, why are they changing it, right? That's probably the question you're thinking. Why not just keep it the way that it is? The reason why I actually think crit and block should be changed is because there is absolutely no way to prevent someone from just getting very lucky off of low crit. To give you an idea, right, compared to my fire, my ice just doesn't have 48% crit. I have around 414, which translates to 21% crit. Meanwhile, I also have 497 block and I have 42% block. So why is it that if I just happen to get lucky and this 21% just happens to trigger more than the 48, because it is still very possible, why is it that I'm getting the same value out of my crit that someone who actually sacrificed stats to get that crit, why am I getting it as much just because of luck? Basically, the way crit and block work at the moment is that there's no failsafe against luck. So that's what this update is about. Now let's look at this update because it's a lot more than just a small update. This is a game-changing update. So there are two parts to this. One, there's the chance of landing the crit, and then there's how much the crit can be expected to do. So let's start off with how they go about in this test realm, how they've gone about making it so that, you know, there's some sort of probability of you landing it or not landing it. According to this dev diary, right, and I'll link it in the description, basically they're saying that for two high-level characters with equal values of crit and block, the new crit block formula will result in a 75% chance to crit and a 25% chance to block. Basically how I guess they've gone about arriving at this number is that you have to make sure when you're giving that bias, right, to crit, you have to think about the fact that there's always a chance that you don't crit and there's a chance that your opponent blocks. So when you're talking about actually landing a successful crit, there are two obstacles it has to go through. That explains the bias in the direction of crit. When you combine all of that, the attacker still has a 56.25% chance overall to crit. They added some other numbers to it, which I honestly really like this because it'll go into how your stats are and how much you value block depending on the school that you play. So if the attacker has not the same but double the crit compared to the block of the opponent, then they'll have an 86% chance of landing the crit. It reminds me a lot of the shadow gauge, basically. So if you guys don't know how the shadow gauge works, again, I could be understanding this wrong, but let's say I have 104 shadow pip rating, right? So depending on the shadow pip rating of my opponent, I'll either get shadow pips at a higher rate or a lower rate. So this stat literally responds to my opponent's stat. So your probability of landing the crit or even landing the block is going to be based on your opponent. But it gets a little trickier than that because not only is the probability of actually landing a crit very different, it's also how much the crit does, and that's where this gets a little crazy. Theoretically, you could actually land a crit, depending on your opponent, that can do literally double the damage. So if someone has no block, your crit will do double the damage. That's actually how that works, which is kind of insane to me. So basically what this dev diary says is for players with 0 block, the maximum damage multiplier that can ever be put on them is ×2, but let's say that they do have block that's like, you know, average for their level, which I don't know what that means. Then you're looking at what crit normally does, which is somewhere from 1.2 to 1.4. What that actually means is that block will be a relevant stat. That's something that you cannot say about PvP right now. Right now, the only schools where block is even mildly relevant is ice, and that's because it's such a high percentage. But even then, when you don't block, this block is useless. Now, if you actually have high block, even if your opponent does land a crit, what it does is make it so that it's not as bad as it could be. So I guess at least at a psychological level, you can feel good about investing into block. And let's say that you do get a crit on a very, very low percentage, the effect of that will probably be much, much lower than you would think. So if someone with a very low probability does happen to crit on somebody, chances are it's probably not actually going to do as much as you would think. What this means is that school identity is actually going to matter a little bit more. So an ice randomly critting simply will not be doing the same amount, and a storm critting with their naturally higher crit is going to matter a little bit more. So there's going to be limits to how far you can stretch the offensive capabilities of, let's say, ice, or maybe death, or balance, or life. And there's going to be, you know, limits to how much you can stretch the defense of, like, a fire or a storm. I think the two big pluses that I can see from this update, one, even when you don't block, even when the crit happens to land on you, your block matters. That's the big deal here. I think that's, for me, that's the big important thing. No matter how they really go about the numbers, that's very important. It's not just complete chance. The other thing is, this opens up the room for certain schools to play into their strengths. That's the other thing. However, I do think that this runs into one small issue. Right now, I think the way gear is designed, you get block by giving up damage. So let's look at some of the most, like, you know, prominent examples at the moment, right? Let's look at wands, for example. They moved pretty much completely away from block. So if you have a wand that's anywhere from 130 or above, you're probably going to notice that it doesn't have block. So if you were to go after a wand with block, let's say, you know, Staff of the Dragon's Maw, or to give an even more extreme example, the Lunar Scepter of Anubis, let's say you really valued block that much. The problem is you're giving up the damage, and even a little bit of pip conserve, right? You're giving up damage. Let's look at the Dragoon gear. The robe does give a lot of block, but the issue is a lot of schools are very not, they're not going to be inclined to use it because you're giving up major damage stats. In this case, again, you're giving up block for damage. Now, at least this example, it's a little bit closer to balance. I think the real reason why people don't use the Malister boots anymore is because of the health. But what I'm trying to say is, right now, the way gear is, especially with wands and Dragoon gear, is that the trade-off to get more block is damage. And I think that if you really are going to relate block and crit, then future gear has to reflect that. That means that the major trade-off for any gear that gives a lot of block should be crit. And it's the same for gear that gives a lot of crit. It should be block. I think right now the issue is there's no real customizability. I feel like gear is way too segregated right now in terms of what it gives. Hats basically never give block. Meanwhile, Athames almost always give block. Amulets nowadays are almost always giving block, and robes, they've really gone towards more block. So the problem is, you're looking at hat, boots, and wands giving a lot of crit, and robes, thames, and amulets always giving block. I'm not saying this necessarily has to be true for every school, but I do think schools like Storm should have more opportunities to have robes with crit. They should have more opportunities to have wands with crit. They should have more opportunities to have thames with crit, more opportunities to have amulets with crit. The only gear that fulfills those kind of things is severely outdated, and you give up too much health for it to be viable. On the bright side, though, I think this kind of update would be really great if you're on the middle ground of stats. So, like, let's take my balance, for example, right? My balance actually has almost the same amount of crit and block, and I think that makes a lot of sense for a school like balance. Maybe, again, this doesn't have to be, like, a rigid thing, but I think my biggest, like, you know, hope with this entire update is that maybe gear gravitates towards some sort of, like, I don't know, maybe a certain ratio. Maybe the gear that Storm gives will generally give it maybe, like, I don't know, a 1.5 or 1.6 multiplier with crit. I think balance should gravitate much more towards that 1.3, and schools like ice, maybe you should gravitate towards, I don't know, 1.1. Obviously, you know, if you wanted to crit a lot more on an ice, that option should still be available. It should be a lot more readily available for storms, fires, mids, those offensive schools. It's definitely a very interesting update. I'm very excited to actually see what stats are going to be good for PvP, especially with new gear that comes out at level 140, depending on how they go about that, right? especially if they break the patterns of a lot of the gear that we've seen, it could make for a completely new era of PvP, and I can tell you right now that stats are going to matter even more than they already do. Crit and block pets could actually make a resurgence. A crit talent could actually matter, because when you do happen to land the crit, it could actually translate to that extra 6% damage that you would normally put a giver on your pet for. So that's very exciting. I hope that they, you know, I hope that they're open to feedback during this, but I just thought I would make this video because this is it's a first real test. I'm so excited. As always, I love to hear y'all's opinions. What do y'all think about crit? Do y'all think this is better than the current system? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? I'm sure the devs read all the feedback on these videos, so speak away, type away. As always, y'all, drop a like if you enjoyed, leave a sub if you're new. I hope I explained this. I'm still trying to grasp it, you know what I'm saying? I hope I explained the update as well as I could. There's tons of links in the description, including my Twitch, my Twitter, my Discord, my Instagram, and of course my Patreon. And as always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong, so stay awesome. And yeah, y'all.